At the time, this was early 1990s. We had been always been sort of tagging along whenever white run organizations decided to do a black event, and that seemed to be the status quo in Nova Scotia. And to supposedly feel very happy when we were blessed with that, which usually meant we only got to do things in February. Um, but as mature individuals, you figure that that can't be a way forward. So we had some discussions among some writers and artists, and decided to form an organization. I guess I'm differentiated from a lot of artists because most of the things I do, I'm self-taught. I In my own life, I was in university headed towards law because all immigrant parents want you to be a lawyer or doctor or something like that. But in my second year of university, I was I was hired to do a research project, which took me to every single Black community in the province. At that time, about 20 to 30. Some of them were not fully communities in the sense, they had been communities, but were down to like, maybe 20 people on a back road, and stuff like that. But once the experience of spending the entire summer talking to people of 100 to 200-year-old communities, actually getting into the real sense of the history and culture of Black Nova Scotians, dialoguing with elders and discovering their art and listening to their folk songs. And so once I came back home, I was done. you know, my mind had been sort of filled up with so many new things, and I found it very difficult to pursue a sort of a conventional path that was just about my own supposedly profession to make others happy. Or, well, when by my second year of college, I mean, you're still kind of finding yourself, but this seemed to be a very real thing for me, unlike my other experiences, even school. And my brain sort of made a tremendous leap. And then I couldn't get it out of my brain, so all my ambitions, I had always been on writing and painting, suddenly had a purpose. And so from that point onwards, it was the war between whether I do a conventional thing or whether I respond to this new impetus to be a kind of a cultural person. And cultural person one. You have to understand, unlike places like Montreal or Toronto or the urban centers, Blacks didn't have a whole lot and were not considered, we did not, you couldn't really apply for grants to get things unless you were stereotypically looking for things to help people get jobs or anti-poverty or things like that were officially recognized as Black things. So it was never a situation where we could enjoy the benefits of a lot of what I began to realize that people in Toronto and Montreal and different arts groups easily access. Nobody in our community had gotten Canada Council grants. Nobody was getting any organizational arts funding or anything like that. as the leader of bands, it became very important to me that, very much like my journey throughout all the Black communities and being inspired by that experience, to kind of lead people into being true to their own experience as a way through. My own example is by bringing forward things that had not been brought forward, and being true to that experience had led me to my own success, both as a writer, as a artist, etc. And so I think the greatest impact that the organization had is that in the midst of all the lack of resources and lack of support for the idea of Black art, um, the artists began to also look towards their own communities as a source of strength and also their own vision. So I think what Bands has done is that it transformed a lot of, because we've started bringing forward a lot of things from the community that nobody ever knew existed. The artists themselves began to be inspired by that, and then their work started reflecting that. So I think that has been our greatest achievement, is that we created a sort of indigenous vision of our own culture that previously had not been there before. The most dramatic thing we did was in 1998. We had the first ever exhibition of Black art in Nova Scotia. This came on an invitation by the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design to do a Black History Month exhibition that they asked me to do, where there was an expectation that they would have 3 or 4 NASCAD graduates be the artists. In the 2 months prior to putting together the exhibition, I suddenly had a notion, because it was getting close to the end of the millennium, and everybody, wherever I went in different galleries, everybody was doing major projects celebrating the new millennium, or the end of the millennium, or the new millennium, except in the Black community. There was no major artistic projects. So I got a little pissed off, to tell you the truth. And then I said, all right, here it is in the year 1998, a whole millennium's done. We've never had a Black art show in our province. We've never, never. And I said, well, maybe I should use the opportunity to put up this gallery to see if there is Black art out there, because it has never been recorded, or, I said people didn't collect Black art, they didn't look for Black art. And so I basically got in a car and drove around the province for a month, back to some of those old places that I had researched before under different circumstances. And this time I was asking people if they knew of any artists, or, people that created anything, whether it was wood carvings, quilts, whatever. A month later, I returned to Halifax with about 500 pieces of work, and kind of blew away the NASCAD folk. And we chose about 100 pieces from that. And we had an exhibition that opened in February of 1998, and it broke the record for attendance at that gallery in its history. And I think that was probably the most dramatic thing we did, because prior to that, there had been no African Nova Scotian art history. Whether the art existed or not, nobody knew about it. It had never been shared. It hadn't even been shared among artists. And so for the first time, we could actually point to this is Black Nova Scotians art that came from a completely different route. The vast majority of the artists were um, untrained, self-taught, folk artists. Um, but that was probably the most glorious moment because I think even the opening, we think about 500 people showed up and half the people were crying because their parents' work had been recognized at last, or you know, and we found art from the late 19th century, like earliest piece about 1880, all the way to the present. So this was not just one thing, it was actually a reclamation of history where there had never been an expectation that we had artists actually active back in the 19th century. We actually, because nobody had bothered to ask or look or do anything else. And it really unleashed the imaginations of the Black arts community. And you could almost trace the development of a lot of our artists from that exhibition. Because I think a lot of artists, even when they had ambitions, they didn't feel connected to anything except whatever the white institutions promoted, yes, but they didn't feel in their own spaces, in their own cultural heritage, um, that kind of connection. And this was real. So that was very significant. 201, we started the first festival that focused on a Black community in Nova Scotia. We did 4 editions of that. That was very significant because again, you have to remember most of the Black communities in our province are 200 years old, existed prior to Canada, and had been growing up sort of alienated from their own history. They were mostly living in isolated areas. They were not taught their own history. Most of them had segregated schools where, up until the 70s, most people did not stay in school. So people practiced their traditions without knowing where these traditions originated, or without even understanding their significance. So one of the things the Preston Festival did is that it reconnected people to their origins. In the first festival, for example, we brought a group from the United States called the Georgia Sea Island Singers from the Gullah Islands off of Carolina and Georgia. Now, these are a group of islands. They call them the Sea Islands. Most of the Blacks in those islands, because of their isolation, did not experience enslavement the way other Blacks did. The owners of those places allowed the Blacks to basically live on their own as long as they did their work, which was mostly growing rice. And the other thing is a lot of Blacks who ran away used to go to the islands, the Georgia Sea Islands, because they were very isolated, and whites, there wasn't that many whites. So they maintained their own hybrid culture, and they had their own dialect. A lot of the practices of North American Blacks, and certainly from the United States, originated there. Religious dance called the ring shout, a lot of our sayings, a lot of our storytelling, a lot of our folk characters originated there because Blacks there were not circumscribed in the same way as in other places. They practiced their religion, they practiced nicknaming. One of the funny things is that, and one of the reasons we brought them is because in reading the history, some of the people in Preston, which is the largest Black community in Nova Scotia, came from the Georgia Sea Islands. but there had never been any connection between the two, nor even an awareness of what that meant. I found out about this because there was a movie called Daughters of the Dusk by a filmmaker named Julie Dash. And while looking at that movie, I saw the similarities between one community, North Preston, and what was I saw in the movies. In the movie, everybody had a nickname. So there was, Sugar Girl and Gingerbread and Flying Wheel and the language style, where like a grasshopper would be called a hopper grass. They'd switch the names. So I immediately recognized that these were a lot of the practices that were going on in North Preston, and was kind of really intrigued that all of the stuff that people did, where people always claimed they were so different up there, but nobody knew why. And here it was, in a whole other part of the world, the origins of that. So yeah, so why that was one of our great achievements, in that we began to connect people to themselves again by examining their histories and showing that a lot of the things that they do that were being, sometimes they were trivialized and sometimes they were even looked down upon, were actually part of a larger tradition. People, as I said, continued traditions, but did not necessarily know about those traditions because our school system never taught about Black history. And there was not that many people who were familiar enough to see these things. The last thing I would probably mention is in 2012, our quilt makers created an exhibition called The Secret Codes. And that is an exhibition of African Nova Scotian quilts inspired by the Underground Railroad. Again, using the sort of bands sort of mandate that we tell everybody to look within your own selves. We looked at our own histories, enslavement, the settlements of our communities, and we created stories around these that I interpreted as designs, and then they made these quilts. These quilts, again, trying to reflect their own culture. And the exhibition opened in 2012 and it became a hit locally, and has remained very popular. In fact, beginning in January 2022, it will be going on national tour. So again, so these are probably three things that bands did that I think really resonated, because they really deeply affected the consciousness of the local people, and created some transformations. And the artists were now creating exhibitions and performances, etc., that were being recognized not only locally but nationally. This is not a province where qualified people stay in the arts, or there's very little support. There's very little support for them in terms of being able to get jobs, or the institutions have not really shifted in any real way towards being very inclusive of Black culture. So we tend to lose all our expertise very quickly. They move to Montreal or Toronto or out west. But we, I said, after 20, almost 20, 30 years of existence, we really have to move towards being much more professional, in the sense of having full-time employees. I basically have been a volunteer for 30 years, and for all its merits. And the fact is now that we can take advantage of more things if we had more expertise available to us. And so we have to figure out, I did spend about 5 years back in the early 2000s we started an art gallery and a center. But I spent all my time writing grant proposals and running out of money, and it killed my art. So I said I'd never do that to myself again, because that's for something that was a labor of love, but it was killing me, you know, because I was sort of left holding the bag, and I said, right now I said I don't mind doing stuff, but so we need people who see themselves in that way as organization builders, because essentially I'm a creative artist more than I am a organization. I mean, I can build organizations, but I don't want to manage them on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's what we need now, because at least now we have the track record and the vision and the possibilities of doing major things. And if we had 3 or 4 people at our disposal, the the government sponsored a couple of things that we thought we would access during the pandemic. You must have heard about the one where they wrote everybody and told them they weren't black, even though they were black. Well, we were one of them. Yeah. Well, I know they didn't read the proposal. See, that's the whole myth. That thing that went out in the middle of the pandemic, making people think that they would get something. And you can imagine us on the periphery here on the East Coast who never gets anything. So we spent about a month preparing that proposal. And we really thought this would be the time that we would grow as an organization. And then we got the letter saying that you did not demonstrate that you were black. This is a group with all black people. But that was very devastating to us, because it was framed in language that kind of gave us a belief that this would be accessible. And then we were sort of devastated by the response. So that was, I only bring it up because it was one of those things that had we gotten it, we would have been moving to that step that we need to take, the professionalization. We would have been able to put in an infrastructure that would have, made it, now we do fairly well with the Canada Council, but we don't have any permanent staff. So that would have given us that other thing that we don't have. So that's what we need right now, is to have 3 or 4 people with expertise who want to run an organization. We've just opened up, I wouldn't say a branch, but a new, for the first time, a Black cultural group in New Brunswick. And there's also a new cultural group in PEI. So we began discussions about doing maritime consultations on a whole bunch of things. So the trick is, and I don't think it'll be me because I'm getting old, and I gotta create my work more than I have to run organizations. If we have that in place now, we are able to do a lot of strategically really great things. So that is the thing I'm hoping for in the next little while as the next step. Maybe some of those young ones will show up and, So we spent a lot of time doing research, actually. We have like 2 or 3 exhibitions that we want to do. We're doing one on Edward Mitchell Bannister. He was the first Black artist in North America to win a major art prize in 1860, when was the centennial? 1876. A sort of a New Brunswick-born Black artist that nobody in Canada knows about. So I went off to New Brunswick and researched his hometown. He's very well known in the United States, but completely unknown in Canada. So we've been researching that in getting ready for the first Canadian exhibition by the Canadian artist that's famous in the United States. that will happen in 2024. So I was able to just focus on the research of that. Been researching another artist from Africville who was very active in the late 1800s. So we've kind of been, yeah, spending more time researching and getting ready, and also just understanding the whole online thing, lining up resource people that can help us make that transition.